the mismatch between your enthusiasm for our speaker and the size of our room. It is what it is, and I told telling John if I'd have known he was going to be so popular and famous, I'd have sold tickets, given them away. But so my name is Andy Porter. I'm the dean here, and welcome. Welcome to today's event, but also welcome to this series of speakers that we bring in each year. And Sean Harper, is Sean here? He probably can't get in. But is he back there?
I don't think so.
Anyway, so Sean, who's a professor here in higher education, and I do this speaker series every year. This is our 7th year, and this is our kickoff speaker. So the reason why I'm saying this is that what we like are to get suggestions for future speakers. And we make it really complicated. All what you have to do is you have to send Sean or I an email naming the individual. And it would be better if you put like a bio and some contact information. But we've actually gotten nominations just to name, looked it up. So it's not that difficult. And you should have it like on your to-do list or your shopping list, you know, because as you go through the year, you come in contact with somebody's work and you say, I would like to meet that person. I'd like to have that person into the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. And I would like to not have to pay for it myself. I'd like the dean to pay for it. So that's the deal. So I hope you'll take Sean and I up on this. So today it's my great pleasure not only to say that, but to introduce our speaker, John Dyke. And John comes to us from that great University of Wisconsin-Madison. Have you ever been to Madison? It's like paradise on earth. And it's actually, when people go there, it's hard to get them to even take a trip off to give a speech. You know, they don't like to be away from it. So. Welcome from that great University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's in the Department of Education, Leadership, and Policy, and he has a doctorate in sociology from Northwestern, and he has I'm seeing a little bit of a theme here. He has an undergraduate degree in political science from Michigan. I think I've named 3 Big Ten universities. He grew up in Lansing, I found out this morning, where there's another great Big Ten university, Michigan State. So, and I know he's been on that campus, took trumpet lessons or whatever over there on the campus. So he's a Big Ten product. He went to Harvard, not to Harvard, he was on the faculty at Harvard, but we forgive him that. He studies I'm going to characterize, I see 3 lines of work in his publications. First and foremost, he does study education leadership, and in particular, he studies what is called distributed leadership. And I know he worked with Jim Spillane, who's a professor at Northwestern, who is one of the people who was the originator of the concept, I think. And Jim has been here to GSE many times to talk about that work and work with people over in Tucson. Yeah. So, secondly, he has published on the achievement gap. And he's got a number of things in the works on the achievement gap and its origins and its solutions. And then thirdly, he has published on accountability in education, and not from 10,000 feet up, but he's looked at the implications for classroom practice. He has been recognized in many ways by many people for his contributions and excellence. I'm going to just single out one. It's one of my favorites, the National Academy of Education Postdoctoral Fellowship, which he had, which I use as one of my many sorting mechanisms on resumes. So without further introduction, I'll just introduce you to John Diamond. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's a great honor to be here, and I'd like to thank you for the invitation, Dina and Sean Harper, Professor Harper. I'm very excited to have this opportunity. I'm glad that the room is full of people, full of good energy for what I hope will be an engaging conversation. So I've been working for several years on issues of race and school outcomes, trying to understand what people often call the racial achievement gap, but what I like to think of as disparities in educational outcomes or opportunity gaps. Achievement gap sort of framing gives us a sense that it's the student's responsibility, that the students aren't living up to the expectations that we have for them, and that somehow we can focus on them individually. My suggestion is that educational opportunity is unequally distributed, and that we need to figure out how to distribute it more equally to provide opportunities for everyone to be successful. By way of introduction, though, I wanted to say a little bit about my motivation, why I come to this work, and why I think it's important, both personally, intellectually, and for the society as a whole. Particularly in the U.S. So my motivation begins where a lot of people begin. This is evidence from the high school transcript study in 2009. And what this shows is GPAs from 1990 to 2009. So we get a sense of the sort of hierarchy in GPAs with Asian Pacific Islander students with a 3.26. They look at 41,000 students and 38,000 transcripts, and found that Asian students have higher GPAs than white students, who have higher GPAs than Hispanic students, who have higher GPAs than African American students, right? And so those GPAs reflect a difference in educational outcomes. Although if you look at 1990 to 2009, you'll notice that everybody got smarter, or there's some kind of grade inflation going on. But at any rate, the hierarchy still sort of exists. We can also look at NAEP data, National Assessment of Educational Progress data, for 13-year-olds in reading, and this is the gap between white and black students, average scale scores. You see this gap here. It had closed substantially in some ways between 1971 and about the late 1980s, and then widened slightly again and began to close again. But we can see there's movement there, but not enough, so that these scores gaps still exist. And the same for Latino students. When compared to white students, there's a gap in terms of the scale scores in reading at 13. Again, right? I think what's interesting here is most of these sort of assessments don't take a look at this gap as much between Asian and white students. The most that you get often in terms of analysis is sort of a cultural interpretation of these differences. Everything seems to be normed on the white students, and then the gaps that get talked about most often are between black and white students. Again, we can think about 25 to 29-year-olds with bachelor's degrees in 2012. And what you'll notice is, again, there's this hierarchy in terms of 25 to 29-year-olds with bachelor's degrees or higher, with Asian and white students being more likely, or Asian and whites 25 to 29-year-olds being more likely to have bachelor's degrees than African American and Latino students. And we know that this has implications for what winds up happening for people economically and the outcomes that they receive in terms of rewards for the jobs that they do. Eventually, a bachelor's degree leads to about $20,000 more a year in income and tax payments. compared to a high school diploma. Similarly, compared to not graduating from high school, not only are there a number of deleterious effects, but there are also, including incarceration rates being higher, voting being lower, and those kinds of things, but there's also a big cost in terms of the money that one earns for the work that they do. So, we keep coming back to these gaps in outcomes and these gaps in opportunity, and the question is, why are they important? Why do we care? Why should we care? Well, one reason to care, one reason that the entire population should be concerned about this is the demographic shifts that are happening in society. These numbers tend to wobble quite a bit in terms of what the projections are, but we do know that by the middle of this century, the white population as a racial group will be, a racial and ethnic group will be less than 50% of the total population of the US, right? And we've started to see these demographic shifts in some states in particular, and also in a number of areas in the society that are often thought of as predominantly white, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But we know that the population is changing. We also know that the requirements for jobs are changing, right? So this study by the Pathways to Prosperity Project at another institution called Harvard, that we already heard that people aren't too fond of, shows that in 1973, 28% of jobs required education, more education than a high school diploma. By 2007, it was 59%, right? And so if we have a society with these demographic shifts happening, we have a society where these achievement gaps exist, and we have a society where the requirements for jobs are going up, we have a problem in terms of our international competitiveness, in terms of our sustainability of our workforce, in terms of a sort of inequality that's been exacerbated over the last few decades. We also might want to think about why should we discuss race and inequality in suburban contexts. And one of the reasons that I argue this is very important is that we've seen major shifts, again, in the population of students who attend suburban schools. In 1993-94, 72% of students who attended suburban schools were white. By 2006-2007, 59% were. And these shifts are happening across the country. And in particular, they're happening in suburban contexts like outside of Philadelphia. So Bob Jarvis was kind enough to send me some images of what's happened in Montgomery County over the last 20 years. And if we look at the sort of local example of suburban change, what we see here is that 0 to 64% non-Hispanic white, 65 to 79.9% non-Hispanic white. As it gets darker, the population becomes less non-Hispanic white, right? And if we look at 1990 and compare it to 2000, we see that that population change is demonstrated there. And if we look at 2000 in comparison to 2010, we see that the population change is demonstrated there as well, right? And so, we have this, and you all probably aren't old enough to know this Chocolate City, Vanilla Suburbs, Parliament Funkadelic reference. Okay, one person, okay. There's this idea that, Washington, D.C., and there are across the country, there are these chocolate cities with their vanilla suburbs. Well, the population is changing and shifting, and so those sort of old understandings of city-suburb distinctions don't necessarily fit anymore as we see these populations shifting and changing. So what I want to do today is sort of, having given you that background and context, talk a little bit about a study I've been working with Amanda Lewis at Emory University on for several years. It's called the Suburban School Achievement Study. What we've done is looked at a multiracial sample of community members from one affluent suburb in the Midwest. It's called Riverview. We interviewed 171 teachers, students, administrators, and parents to try to understand their experiences and interpretations of why race and achievement was such a problem in their district, and I'll say more about the district in just a minute. We also had survey data from 40,000 students, 6th through 12th grade students, across 15 suburban school districts, all who were participants in an organization that was working to address the racial disparities in kids' outcomes. It's our interview sample. We had 171 folks, and you can sort of see the breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity of the people we interviewed. Interesting thing that came out of these interviews, and we'll talk some more about this as we go forward, is a sort of common set of ideas about the experiences of students from different backgrounds. So white students were often talking about the experiences of black students in the same way that black students were talking about them. White parents were often talking about achievement issues in similar ways to African American parents or Latino parents. And in some ways, we grew to understand a sort of common set of understandings about what was happening in the context of this place. We selected Riverview because it defied a lot of our sort of assumptions about race and achievement. It's an integrated suburb, and it's been integrated since the 1960s. It voluntarily integrated its schools. While there was pressure from the NAACP and other organizations for more school integration, it was voluntary in the sense that there was no court mandate. The community came together and decided they needed to set up a system that would create integrated schools. It serves a relatively affluent African American and Latino population, so we're not talking about the sort of typical disparities of social class and race. We're talking about a predominantly middle class community where we still see differences in outcomes. It obviously reflects a growing demographic reality, with Latino and African American students being more prominently represented in the suburbs. And we felt like it presented a best case scenario for understanding race and achievement issues. Best case scenario meaning that we thought this was a place where if race and achievement was not going to be an issue, this might be the place. It's a liberal community. People move there because of its racial diversity. There's an express commitment to diversity, this idea of voluntary desegregation, and a commitment to addressing these issues that had been longstanding, right? So we thought if anywhere was going to be the place to study these issues, this might be it. This might be the place where we could expect to see some movement. And we used the case of Riverview to understand how race functions simultaneously on structural, institutional, and interpersonal levels to shape the experiences of students, right? Oftentimes we understand race and we understand it as a function of kids' cultural backgrounds. We understand it as a function of processes like tracking. We understand it as a process of teachers' expectations, or we understand it as sort of all about social class. What we've tried to do in our work is think about the ways that history and the contemporary context, the historical structures of inequality and contemporary structures of inequality, the school practices, and the sort of social dynamics, particularly around the social psychology of race and status, actually simultaneously overlap with each other and impact kids' educational experiences. And so hopefully as we go through the day, we'll be able to unpack that a bit. So one of the things I wanted to do, though, is introduce you to Riverview, why we think of it as a highly resourced place and that has positive outcomes. The first thing is that it's racially diverse and relatively stable in its diversity. When we started our research, it was 48% white students, 41.3% African American students, 8.5% Hispanic students, and 2.1% Asian Pacific Islander students. And so we had a sort of diverse racial population. While it was largely African American and white, there was still the racial diversity there that made it an interesting place to study, and it was stably integrated. It also had a lot of resources, so the per pupil expenditures in the district we call Riverview was substantially higher than the state average and the city next door, right? So there's a big city that's spending quite a bit less than Riverview. We also compared Riverview in terms of the teacher's level of education, master's degree versus not having a master's degree. And when we looked at Metro and also looked at Riverview, Forestville, and Valleyside, which are two other suburbs in the area, we see that the suburban contexts have teachers with higher levels of education. And so again, highly resourced place, invested in diversity, lots of money, highly qualified teachers. And we also looked at some of the outcomes. Riverview's graduation rates are higher than the graduation rates in Metro and in the state. For African Americans and whites, For the Hispanic population, not substantially higher, but pretty consistently here for these two groups is much higher than the city. Graduates often go to college, so 75% or more students in every year have gone on to college. So again, they're sending people to university. So while we can look at these positive outcomes and we can look at these positive resources and think of this as a place where we might find and have some leverage on challenging achievement disparities, there are also these disparities that are relatively persistent. So one thing we can look at is test scores. And we look at test scores on the ACT test. What we see is for white students, they do better than the national average. African Americans do as well, but you see these big disparities here between white students and African Americans, and again between Latinos and white students. Right? We look at GPA. White and Asian student cumulative GPAs, 3.5, compared to Latino and African American students, 2.4. And then I said people go on to college when they leave the school for the most part. But what we found when we looked more closely at this is they're going to college, but they're going to different colleges, and different kinds of colleges. So we've seen this expansion in college going, but a lot of that expansion is within a stratified system, 2-year versus 4-year colleges, for-profit versus not-for-profit colleges. And here, what we see is African American, white and Latino and Asian students and where they wound up going, 94.7% of white students are going to 4-year schools, right? Whereas for African Americans, it was about 70%, but 30% were going to 2-year schools. For Latinos, a larger percentage were going to 2-year schools. And so we see this as another example of the disparities that exist in this context. So highly resourced place, what's going on? How can we understand it? So there are a couple key things that I want to try to do today in trying to unpack, what's going on in this place, right? One is I'm interested in trying to understand what's racial about the racial outcome or opportunity gap, right? And I'm going to draw particularly on contemporary theories of race as well as gender and work in social psychology to really try to understand what's racial, because oftentimes when we study race, it's a variable or it's culture. And it often doesn't get unpacked in terms of the way that it impacts people's social interactions and experiences. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about how racial inequality exists and persists in the post-civil rights era. How can we be post-racial? How can we have an African American president? How can we believe that a lot of the struggles that existed in the civil rights era have been overcome, but still find these racial disparities being present and persistent? So again, what I'm hoping to do here is examine structures, interpersonal dynamics, and institutional practices that help sustain racial inequality. So one explanation for understanding these inequalities has been an oppositional culture argument. We had a conversation about John Ogbu earlier, and this idea of coping with the burden of acting white, right? So people have heard about this set of ideas. I'm sure you probably studied it in your classes. Yeah, you can nod or something. So you've heard about this idea, and I'm sure that you've had debates about it. And one of the things that I was talking with Dean Porter about is this sort of way in which people keep coming back to these issues. My colleague Amanda Lewis has written an interesting paper on this, and I've written several around the idea of oppositional culture and acting white being very persistent within the literature, and to some extent beyond the level of support it has empirically. So their basic argument that John Ogbu sort of puts forward is that oppositional culture is in some ways a way of understanding and explaining differences in achievement and outcomes across minority groups from different circumstances. And it's a lot about the incorporation process, how people are either involuntary minorities or voluntary minorities. That involuntary minorities are more likely because of experiences of discrimination and inferior education and their sort of orientations toward the dominant or broader society to develop oppositional orientations towards schools, to feel that educational institutions do not reward their efforts within the school, and that within the job market, they don't get rewarded for their abilities. And therefore, there's an oppositional orientation that develops within the community that impacts what happens in the context of school. Fordham and Ogbu, building on this, Ogbu's cultural ecology theory, argued that African American students come to identify schools as white institutions and accuse their peers who strive to do well academically or engage in academically oriented behaviors of acting white, and therefore discourage their peers from achieving academically. So this idea has been very popular, and it's one of these ideas from social science that actually is represented a lot in the sort of popular media and popular literature. So Carla O'Connor and her colleagues, Ann Horvath and Amanda Lewis, looked at the number of citations in the popular press around the idea of acting white, and between '87 and 2004, there were 150 plus times this appeared in the popular media, right? So it's something that's out there as an idea that people gravitate towards and draw on as they try to understand inequality. Bob Herbert wrote in 1995 that some African American students unable to extricate themselves from the quicksand of self-defeat have adopted the incredibly stupid tactic of harassing fellow blacks who have the temerity to take their studies seriously. According to this poisonous logic of the harassers, any attempt at acquiring knowledge is a form of acting white, and that, of course, is to be shunned at all costs. Clyde Haberman in 2006 writes the following: and there is the inescapable reality that hitting the books essential to making it in medicine or any other profession is often mocked as acting white, an anti-education mindset that some leading black figures like comedian Bill Cosby have attacked in recent years as fostering a culture of failure, right? So this idea sort of not only emerges in the scholarly discourse, but also emerges in the popular media as well. And then finally, we've seen then Senate candidate Barack Obama, hopefully this works, make the following statement in 2004 that's been repeated many times since.
Go into any inner city neighborhood, and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach our kids to learn. They know that parents have to teach, that children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth with a book is acting white. They know those things.
And we can think about how this keeps coming back, because when Michelle Obama recently gave a speech at Bowie State, one of the things that she said is, my husband is fond of saying, we need to eradicate this slander that a black youth with a book is acting white. So it's there, it's out there in the discourse, but is it really supported? Does oppositional culture really explain these gaps? And what the research suggests is not really. African American students as a group are no less engaged in school than their white peers. Black students want to attend college at the same rate, spend about the same amount of time on homework, and have similar rates of absenteeism when compared to their white counterparts of the same social class. High achieving African Americans are among the most popular with their peers. And there are several studies that have recently come out. I think in some ways, Angel Harris's book, Kids Don't Want to Fail, is one that sort of picks apart this argument in the most detail I've seen. As well as, I know Carolyn Tyson was here and talked about her book, Integration Interrupted. One of the interesting things is she spent a lot of time talking about this acting white phenomenon and when it does emerge. And one of the things she suggested is it emerges in places like Riverview, potentially, where when it does emerge, among the small number of students it emerges for, it might emerge in a place like Riverview, where race and achievement are highly correlated, where folks find themselves in different educational locations and educational tracks, and where there is some inequality in income, and where the idea of race becomes attached to achievement because of what's happening in the local context. Interestingly, though, we really didn't find that in our work. I have a paper that I'll share with folks that I've written with James Hughley, a former graduate student who's now at Pitt doing a postdoc, where we looked at our survey data from this study and found that, as most of the other research finds, that black students were actually more achievement-oriented, more invested in their education studies, wanted their friends to study harder and get better grades, had higher educational aspirations than their white peers. So as this research keeps finding this finding over and over again, and people keep trying to figure out what's wrong with the data, as opposed to figuring out what's wrong with the assumptions, that was, yeah. Anyway, so I'd be happy to share that paper with folks. Finally, this is from adapted from Doug Downey and his colleagues' work, where they looked at the national assessment, the NELS, and one other data set. And what they found is that when you look at black students and white students, and you compare them across all of these dimensions except one, black students are more pro-school than white students. The only one where you see black students being less pro-school is the idea of discipline being fair. Right? So we'll come back to this idea of discipline, but I'll be happy to talk more about this oppositional culture piece. But our book that I'm, and the research that we're talking about, we wanted to dispel this piece, so we do have a nice chapter on that, but I'm not going to talk about it anymore because it keeps getting talked about and the evidence to support it really isn't there. Yes?
I was just going to ask real quick, when you have like some of the ones like okay to break rules, okay to cheat, when it says like yes, more pro school, does that mean that the kid would say like no, it's not
flipped.
okay to
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
I just
yeah.
wanna
It's
make
not,
sure
yeah,
I
yeah.
understand it correctly.
Yeah. So this is analysis that Ron Ferguson did several years ago on the data set, which basically demonstrates what I was just saying. He looked at this idea percent of who agree across these racial groups with these statements. My friends make fun of people who try to do well in school. Studying a lot tends to make you less popular. It's very important, or my friends think it's very important or important to study hard to get good grades. And what we find is that there are, across this 40,000 student sample, not big differences. And in some cases, and this isn't controlled for social class. So when we look across this large set of data, again, we don't see evidence for oppositional culture. So what I'd like to suggest, I don't have a clear sense of how I'm doing for time, but 20 minutes? I'm calculating my 20 minutes, okay, so I can do this in 20 minutes. So I have this a set of ideas that suggest an alternative perspective for understanding this beyond oppositional culture. One is, the idea is really this idea of a racialized educational terrain, a terrain in which structural, institutional, and institutional inequality and race-based status beliefs shape kids' educational outcomes and experiences, and at these multiple levels influence each other in ways that mutually reinforce inequality. The structural inequalities outside schools deal with things like income, wealth, racial segregation, and differences that exist across racial groups. Institutional inequality inside schools, Black and Latino students are placed in the least favorable positions for learning and achievement throughout their educational trajectory through things like tracking school resource disparities and segregation, and that race-based status beliefs are stories and narratives that justify structural and institutional inequalities help reproduce these inequalities and these disparities. So I want to say just briefly about the structural inequalities. One of the things we see is that these inequalities in a community like Riverview, where we think of it as a middle-class community, in a community where African Americans and Latinos have middle-class status, when we unpack it a little bit further, what we see is that even though we're talking largely about middle-class folks, the disparities in terms of median family income, families living in owner-occupied housing, and individuals below the poverty line all reflect differences in terms of that won't be picked up necessarily if we're looking only at the sort of basic measures of social class. So we're talking about wealth disparities that exist in communities that I think have implications for us thinking about inequality that exists in the context of the school. As students navigate an environment where these wealth disparities exist, they obviously recognize them. So what Rosa argues is that most of the white kids have really big houses and they live by the river, which is sort of like mansions. Us, the Mexicans, yeah, we have our house or whatever, but it's not as big as theirs. They come with Abercrombie and whatever. I don't even know how to pronounce that. There was this one day I went into the mall with my sister. I walked into that store. I did not feel right. It was all white people around me. I just walked out, right? So this idea that there's not only the sort of wealth disparities and income disparities that exist within the community, but also differences in sort of cultural styles that become representative of what gets rewarded and valued in the school context. There are also institutional inequalities inside school, and I'll talk a little bit about how these institutional inequalities are sort of reinforced by the structural inequalities. So I talked before about the composition of the school as a whole, and you see the racial diversity, particularly Black, white, and Latino students being represented in pretty large numbers in the school. But when we look at what it looks like in terms of honors, AP, and regular level classes, what we see is white students representing almost 90% of the kids in AP classes, almost 80% of the kids in honors classes, and Black and Latino students representing a large percentage of the students in regular level classes, right? And it's not just being in these classes and just the content that gets covered. There's also the issue of teacher tracking. Not only in this school in Riverview did we find that students would wind up in these different locations, but we also found out that teachers were essentially being tracked as well. So that the most qualified teachers with the most experience wound up teaching the students who had demonstrated the highest level of achievement prior to getting into those classes. Yes.
Just a quick question on the previous slide. Were the Asian students represented in those tracked classes?
Yeah, so I didn't have the data for Asian students in this particular piece of data. They tended to be more likely to be located in the honors and AP classes than their representation in the lower level classes, but given that it was a relatively small population, it wasn't necessarily as meaningful to represent it in this kind of way. That's a good question. I can get that information in more detail for you if you want to talk. And so, with this idea of teacher tracking, one of the things that happens is students come to realize and recognize that the differences in the levels are also differences in the quality of instruction. So as one student said, when I moved down from my honors to my regular, I didn't know how far back I was actually going. I just got frustrated because it was so easy. Like you find yourself doing bad because it's so easy. You don't try, and it's boring and it's frustrating. And in this school, it's kind of backwards because the really good teachers are in the honors and AP teachers, and the bad teachers are the regulars. And it seems like it should be the opposite, right? So we sort of see this process of tracking, and it demonstrates itself not only in where students wind up, but the quality of instruction they get. But if we think back to the sort of structural inequality that exists in the community in terms of white parents having more income and resources, even though many of the people in the community are middle class, one of the things that we find is that there are ways in which that structural inequality helps them shape what happens in the context of the institution, right? And so we borrow work by Tilley and others on opportunity hoarding to try to understand this theoretically. Opportunity hoarding is the process through which dominant groups who have control over some good, for example, education, regulate its circulation, thus preventing outgroups from having full access to it. And we can think historically about the complete exclusion from education of African Americans during slavery, the process of segregation during Jim Crow, and the contemporary process, de facto segregation, as being manifestations of this. Anderson, in her book, The Imperatives of Integration, writes that U.S. whites have long hoarded opportunity by establishing school systems that provide no or inferior education to blacks, Latinos, and Native Americans. And we argue and found when we talked to Riverview teachers and administrators that they felt that middle class, particularly middle class white parents, hoarded educational opportunity by ensuring the highest quality seats for their own kids. So how does tracking and opportunity hoarding actually work? Well, one of the ways that the school system tried to deal with the tracking system, the administrators tried to deal with it, was that they tried to say that parents could have the right to override decisions. The decisions were supposed to be made on teacher recommendations, test scores, and grades, right? And they added this other element where parents could have an influence on the decision-making process. But in some ways it backfired because the parents with the more power and resources were the ones who were advocating more often for their kids to get in these higher classes. So as one of the administrators told us, I truly think that this school policymakers have created a monster which upholds the achievement gap by allowing the parents to have the final say. That regardless academically, what is good for your child is not academically sound. What happens is a lot of times they put their kids in honors classes, they don't do well, or as well as they want. They're getting C's, and then they're paying, the ones can pay the big bucks for tutors to teach the kids the whole time. For what? Right? There's also the issue of wanting to make changes in the context of the tracking system, which the school has done in multiple ways, and getting pressure, anticipating pressure, or receiving actual pressure from parents. Another district administrator talked about the fact that the students whose parents are advocating the most are often the students who have the highest sort of school performance, and they're trying to protect their position with the highest quality teachers in the highest level classes. So, as the district administrator said, although we want to serve everyone, sometimes the effort and energy towards straight A students, which is great, which is they're tax-paying and great people, but you can only take so many calls, make so many appointments, answer so many emails. But we realize that if they increase their volume and then we've got everything in between, we'll never get anything done. So this idea of you're sort of constantly responding to these parents with the power and resources to sort of influence what's happening in the context of the school. And finally, one administrator told us that responding to the middle class and upper class white parents in particular was taking an exorbitant amount of time and causing them to sort of just give in eventually, right? I counted them at one point. I attended over 200 meetings with parents of kids to talk about the standards and the fact that we needed common standards for all kids, not different standards for different kids, and to reassure people that our high-end kids this was not about dumbing down the curriculum, right? So as they tried to talk about creating mixed ability classes, mixed level classes, or leveling out the tracking system in the school, they got the response and resistance from parents of high-end students who were constantly pushing back, asking for meetings, challenging the process. Finally, they try to do a lot of this work in social studies, and particularly in area studies. So they would have African American studies, American history, AP US history, or honors US history. And what they found is that a lot of times students were interested in studying African American history, white students, but their parents, once they got into those classes, would tell them, oh, well, you really need to be studying Russian history. You really need to be studying something else. So there was what we would call a white flight from the mixed ability classes within the context of the school. So as one American history honors teacher told us, many of our honors kids that I had as a freshman in African American history had parents who strong-armed them, white kids, into studying Russian history. And they said, well, Mommy, I have no interest in Russian history. I want to study Africa. They say, you're taking Russian. Or Mommy, I have no interest in the Middle East. And the parent would say, you're taking Middle East. And those classes have become largely white honors classes, Russian and Middle East, right? So even within the structure, as they tried to change the structures, tried to create mixed level social studies classes where we know diverse classes help kids' learning. they were still sort of hoarding opportunity and trying to move away from the integrated classroom. The irony of this is that many of these people have moved to Riverview because of its diversity. They go to the school because they want their kids to have diverse experiences, but when they get into the classroom, they're often separate. One administrator, talked about it as, it's like two ships and leading parallel lives because they don't really find themselves in classes that are as diverse as a school as a school as a whole. I want to shift gears now. So talk about the structural issue and sort of the institutional piece of it as it relates to opportunity hoarding. I want to shift gears a bit to talk a little bit about social psychology and race. I probably have like 10 minutes now, right? Okay. Okay, so we have this idea of race being a social construct, and the American Anthropological Association has talked about this, that while most people think about race as something that's real and tangible genetically, it's not. It's a set of ideas that we've attached to people's bodies that really have no real biological meaning in terms of understanding diversity of genetic structures. So we're really one racial group, we're one human species. We have these things like skin color, hair texture, that people have decided to make meaningful. We don't always study it that way though. And so one of our challenges is trying to think about how race matters, how race can be a social construct but actually have implications for people as they move through the world. So as Rebecca Blank and her colleagues on the National Academy's Press book argue that most social scientists agree that race is a social construct, that definitions of racial group membership sort of change over time, and those categories morph over time, and that while race is a social construct, it has structural, institutional, and personal implications, right? And it has those implications because of the meaning that people attach to it. And one of the things that we argue is that race-based performance expectations and status beliefs have real implications for people's interactions when they're interacting with each other in the context of schools. What are status beliefs? So Cecilia Ridgway and her colleagues have done a lot of work on the idea of status beliefs. And status beliefs are widely shared cultural beliefs that people who belong to one social group are more esteemed and competent than those who belong to another social group, right? And what these beliefs can do is they can set up performance expectations when people interact with each other. One of the things that we notice immediately when we see someone often is race, and we often notice gender almost immediately, or sex almost immediately. And we attach meaning to what those things mean. So one study by Diva Pager, who was at Princeton, I think she's at Harvard now, looked at what wound up happening when you sent field testers out to look for jobs in a low-wage service sector employment. And what she found is that when you took Black, Latino, and white applicants with the same skills and sent them out for jobs, white applicants were much more likely, particularly than African American applicants, to get callbacks, right? Even with the same credentials. Then she looked at people, she sent out white, Black, and Latinos with the same credentials. The white person said they had a felony record. The African Americans and Latinos had clean records, and the white applicants got more callbacks than the African Americans, right? Status playing out in access to resources, right? And we make the argument that it actually plays out in the dynamics of everyday interaction in the context of schools, because one of the characteristics of race, and particularly African American race, has always been this idea of race and intelligence, right? That race and intelligence are linked. And what we argue is that there are three ways that this sort of plays itself out in performance expectations that permeate the environment, and racial microaggressions that are felt by people who are the target of mistreatment based on stereotypes, and then stereotype threat, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So I won't talk about stereotype threat. I want to talk a little bit about performance expectations and then make a couple final points. Teresa Perry has made the following statement about what winds up happening to African American students in particular in the context of schools. She makes the argument, as I said before, that this idea of intellectual inferiority sort of permeates the taken for granted notions that people have about intelligence. And so she argues that there are extra social, emotional, cognitive, and political competencies that are required of African American youth precisely because they are African American. So when we drop, when we think about race and outcomes, it's hard to control for these kinds of dynamics, right? So one of the things that qualitative work can add to larger quantitative studies is to try to think about the mechanisms and processes that are at play. So as Ms. Tyson argues about the experience of students navigating the school, if they're Black, white, or Latino in particular, she says, well, if you're a student of color, could be African American or Latino, there are assumptions that you don't care about school, that you don't have the capability of being successful in school. And so those are negative messages that they have to hear with and deal with every day. Gabe is sort of more direct in talking about this. He's a white sophomore, and he talks about how he's rewarded for his whiteness and other students are penalized for their ethnicity and race. I guess I'm white, so I'm expected, to be smarter. Usually when someone sees me, they always think I'm smarter than most people. I think usually the perception is that Black people are dumber than white people and Hispanics are not as smart as everyone else. So if you have a really smart Black person, that's when you see the most. That's weird, right? So this idea of somebody being out of their role essentially because they're a high-achieving Black student. Ms. Christie talks about this sort of link in some ways between stereotypical African-American cultural mannerisms and how those get attached to intelligence. So she talked about a student, there was a teacher who had a minority student come into the honors class, and he was stereotypical baggy pants, big shirt, hat turned sideways, and she said to him, I think you belong in my next period, you're too early, and assumed that he was a general student. And he's like, no, my schedule says I belong here. Right? That gets to this idea of racial microaggressions. Basically, what racial microaggressions are instantaneous moments of insult, essentially, that are subtle, cumulative, and have impacts on people. As Chester Pierce argued, they are the substance of today's racism. They can range, as Smith says, from racial slights to recurring indignities or irritations, unfair treatment, stigmatization, hypersurveillance, etc. In a recent survey, 98.1% of African Americans said they had experienced racial discrimination in the past year and 100% in their lifetimes, right? So the perception of experiencing this discrimination combined with these sort of micro level insults has implications for kids as they navigate schools as well. So getting back to this idea of a Black male student achieving at high levels and having that be something that surprised other students, David, who's a high achieving African American student, says, I just think that kids aren't used to seeing successful Black male student. Whenever I do something that's just normal, they're like, whoa. A lot of times racism is indirect. You won't come out directly and say, whoa, you're Black. Black males aren't supposed to do that. There are just like undertones that you pick up and stuff. These kinds of subtle insults and subtle messages are the kinds of things that reinforce perceptions of inequality, perceptions of ability, and can impact students as they navigate school. I'm gonna do this even though I'm gonna go over time. Am I going over time yet? I got like 2 minutes.
Hi.
Thank you. Ish. Okay. So we have this idea that these status beliefs have real implications for people's interactions, but we've also got a situation where all of the policies of a school are stated in neutral terms, and we should expect that people should be treated relatively equally, right? But that gets us to the place of trying to think about the sort of organizational routines in the context of schools that I think can help us understand how inequalities get embedded within organizations and within institutions, right? Organizational routines are sort of the standard set of practices through which the activities of schools and organizations get done. They can be things like grade level meetings, the sort of beginning of the day ritual, but they can also be things like discipline routines, course placements, tracking, and those kinds of things. And organizational routines have what we would call ostensive aspects and performative aspects. The ostensive aspects are those aspects that are sort of the ideal of the routine, how it's supposed to work, how people understand it. In some ways, it's the thing that gives the routine or a discipline policy its legitimacy. The performative aspect is how it actually works in practice. And I argue that it's the performative level at which the inequalities become embedded within these organizational routines. And I'll give you a couple examples of this. And think about discipline and punishment in the context of Riverview. So the school rules have the sort of moral authority of being stated neutrally and sort of having a purpose that's universal. And Ann Ferguson talks about this in her book Bad Boys, which is a great study of race and discipline. So Mr. James, who's a high school administrator, says, talking about the school discipline handbook, this is our guide. It tells us the discipline rules. It tells us the consequences. We don't care if you're white, black, Hispanic, Russian, Asian, Hebrew, Chinese. We're going to follow the book. When I come into this building, I don't see colors. I see people. There are no favors, right? But then later in the same interview, what Mr. James says, I don't think the have-nots are always treated the same. I think if your parents can afford lawyers and can talk very loud and are very educated and the like, you might stand a greater chance of getting away with something or having something overturned or having it explained away for you. The have-nots, they're seen as rude, disrespectful, impolite, and they don't generally get away with it because for the most part, the have-nots' parents are not going to come over here and deal with it, right? So in the same interview, he's sort of bringing out this contradiction between the way it's supposed to be and the way it happens in practice. And the students and other administrators sort of recognize this. As one Riverview teacher said, if you're looking at just disruptive sort of loud behavior, it's students of color, but the loudness is part of their culture. You go home, you go into their family, you go into my family, you see that. We're loud, we're ha ha ha, and that's how we behave. And I think a lot of times these students have a different idea of what's appropriate, right? So it goes even further into the ways in which there's enforcement of appropriate dress and behavior, moving through the hallways and classroom interactions. And I'll just talk about the appropriate dress and behavior and then go on to the conclusion. So with regard to appropriate dress, there are common rules about appropriate dress in the school that everyone is supposed to follow. This is what I would call the ostensive aspect of this routine. Students are expected to behave in a responsible and cooperative manner at all times. Appropriate dress and grooming are critical to the maintenance of a safe, educationally conducive school atmosphere and are mainly the responsibility of the student and the parent. Maintaining a neat and modest appearance and not wearing clothing that could be deemed offensive to others helps promote a comfortable learning environment. Everybody can agree with that, right? That's a good thing. And it's, it gains its legitimacy by using language that sort of says it's universally applied and universally agreed upon. But what winds up happening is that all clothing is not interpreted equally. So what Jen, black sophomore, said is, if you've got some cornrows and if you're coming in with some low clothes on, the teacher's going to be like, here's a troublemaker. When you see a boy walking in some khakis and a dress shirt, you don't think the same way. A boy walking with some baggy clothes on, even though the boy has khakis, the boy with the khakis may be more of the troublemaker. You just don't think that way. What Maria, let me go back here. What one Riverview teacher talked about with regard to the sort of brief and revealing clothing is that it's not applied equally to black and white girls. We had a policy that girls couldn't have their belly showing. All you saw walking up and down the hall was girls with their white bellies out. Black girls sent home. black girls were pissed off. One black student said, well, why are you saying something to me? I'm sitting up in a room with 6 white girls with their stomachs out, and you pick me out of the group. Right? Another example of this is Tiffany having this experience with appropriate and inappropriate dress. We asked her if the school was, fair in its treatment of students, or if there were differences in the way students were treated. She said, if you go by a dress code, definitely not. You know how white people have those little slim bodies and all that? They can wear the skirts that come right up to their butt cheek. Now, if I were to put that on or something like that, I get sent home immediately. And we're not allowed to wear spaghetti straps. But you see a lot of white girls wearing spaghetti straps, halter tops, tube tops, stuff like that. Black girls would get sent home for it. And so we asked, have you seen that sort of thing happen? And what do they do when it happens? And what she says is, well, they give you a T-shirt to make you go to the office and wear it all day. Final thing I'll say about this is students had to have hall passes to move through the hallways. One of the things that was recognized by white students and African American students is that, while students are supposed to have hall passes, students who leave a room during a period must get a valid pass from the teacher or supervisor. Students without a valid pass face consequences. What wound up happening is, as they were moving through the hall, black students, particularly black male students, were often pulled out and singled out for demonstrating their, showing their pass. As one administrator talked about, I've had a number of majority students say when I ask, do you need a pass? No, because I never get stopped. Black kids are like, I need a pass because they're going to stop me. Just their perception is very different. As Mary, a white sophomore, said, I think security guards I think they point out African Americans a lot more than white. Like, I'll walk down the hallway without a pass and they're just going to let me go. But then they'll find someone else and they'll say, you have to go to Saturday detention. I think it's really uncalled for the way they don't stop everyone, right? And finally, Samantha, I've been walking down the hall without a pass and a black guy's walking down the hall without a pass and the black guy gets stopped and I walk by. That's not fair. So just the ways that these dynamics play themselves out, I think making a concerted effort to look at the distinction between the sort of ideal of an organizational routine, the ideal of school rules, and how they actually play out in practice has real implications for understanding how these inequalities might manifest themselves in schools, how they become embedded in the interactions that happen in schools, and how they shape long-term outcomes for students over time. So just by way of concluding, and hopefully we have a few minutes to talk, I make the argument that racial and ethnic outcome differences are not explained by oppositional culture, that white students and black and Latino students have qualitatively different experiences in school, that the structural inequalities outside school are reflected inside schools, and that they manifest themselves through this process we call opportunity hoarding, that black and Latino students are often located in the least advantageous locations for learning and achievement, and that we need to make sure that all students have access to high quality instruction, and that the social psychological dimension is critically important, that race-based status beliefs impact the everyday experiences of black and Latino students through performance expectations, racial microaggressions, stereotype threat, and the like, inside and outside of the classroom. And so I'll stop there, and hopefully we can have some conversation.
I'm sorry, I need to apologize for me and my students. As I mentioned to you, we have a class visit here, but we have a presentation we have to get to. So I'm apologizing for taking my students out before the Q&A. Thank you. I'm sure all of us really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The conversation.
So I know there were, as people leave, I know there were a lot of ideas shared and trying to collapse the, sort of whole of this project into a few minutes, or at least big chunks of it into a few minutes. I might have talked pretty quickly, but hopefully we can clarify and talk and we can push back.
Yeah, I just have a thank you so much for your talk. I mean, this is very interesting. As a student who grew up in a suburban school and had that similar experience, I wonder what was the response of the school when they read your findings about these different levels in which there's an opportunity gaps?
So, you know, what's interesting is that I've done workshops with the school. I've talked with them, you know, often. I have a relationship with some administrators, and so there's a sort of ongoing dialogue. One of the challenges of trying to make change in these kind of places, and folks who work in these kind of places sort of know this, is that they can often recognize that the problem is there, but they have a hard time figuring out how to address the problem. So it's sort of a, you know, dialectical relationship in some ways. You know, you sort of have, you know, this effort to try to make a change, and you have this pushback, and you sort of have to incrementally make changes and try to make changes in one subject area, or try to track inequalities in discipline and try to figure out where the intervention point is. So there are these dynamics of how do you sort of address these race and achievement issues, even in a place where people are concerned about it. And for some people who want to keep their jobs, for example, they're concerned, if I'm a superintendent, what's going to happen to me? How do I band together with other superintendents who are working on the same issue to sort of bring light to this across multiple districts rather than just mine? How do I sort of respond to people who are resistant with evidence? I've worked with the school district to try to provide them with, you know, sound evidence that these mixed level classes aren't hurting anyone and are helping some kids. I mean, so there are a lot of different strategies that people can use, but one of the big challenges is those parents with the resources often engage in practices that, you know, make it difficult to make change. For example, one of the administrators said to me, you know, this grade weighting thing is a real problem. People in these grade weighting in honors and AP classes, you get, you know, one person was saying, well, I know this white kid, and this kid is not doing that well, but then when you reflect on it, it's like, oh, well, they get a 0.5 bump every time they, you know, they get a C at something else, or if they're an AP, they're getting, and so, but when I asked about, you know, trying to remove the grade weights, they said that's a non-starter, not gonna happen, because they gotta have a 4.4 to get into Harvard or Yale or Penn or, you know, so it's again, you know, it's a sort of difficult dynamic of, they engage in practices that reinforce the inequality, and they feel stuck because they're not quite sure how to deal with it.
Just out of curiosity, did the faculty and staff at the school racially kind of mirror the student population, or did it lean one way or the other?
It was, it had changed over time, but it's about 20% African American, a smaller number of Latino, and Asian, majority white.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think it's on this one.
You put that number up.
Yeah,
I had a hard time seeing
73
the
or
bottom of
4%
that.
were white.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, and that's another dimension of this is when you have students and teachers of different racial groups, perceptions of their engagement, students' engagement and investment and behavior is influenced a lot by a cross-race match as opposed to a same-race match.
And I apologize also if this, I couldn't see the bottom half of the
I'm
screen.
because
No, it's not your fault at all. The breakdown of the positions that were held by the African American faculty, I mean, were they faculty, were they staff, were they?
Yeah, there was a mix of faculty, administrators, staff members, and parents. I mean, and parents were the adults that we.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Oh, no.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just curious about intersectionality,
Yep.
and I have two questions along those lines. The first is, did you, in your sample of respondents, have African American families who were more well-to-do, and did you notice differences in how race was perceived, or status beliefs about African Americans who were wealthier
Yeah.
versus those who were not? were those students perhaps held up as tokens of, oh, this is a meritocratic system because look, this person is in honors or AP, or, I mean, I'm just curious about what you saw in the data on that subject, and then also similarly along the lines of gender, whether you saw, I know Ann Ferguson in her book pointed out that there was differential treatment, especially of Black boys, and how they were funneled through school and how they were treated.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part. So in terms of discipline practices, we definitely found that Black males in particular, Latino males, were singled out more for discipline and for somewhat harsher discipline. But we were not necessarily looking at suspension and expulsion. We were looking more at the day-to-day management of people's bodies in the school context. And that became sort of this hyper-surveillance and feeling surveilled a lot. So the gender dynamics there. But as you can see, it manifests itself differently for Black boys and girls. So that, for girls, for boys it was about violence and threat. For girls it was about, sexuality and how they were sort of represented in their physical being. And so, but there were some ways in which race and gender played themselves out differently in the context. The other thing about what I would suggest is that what we found is that, so we might think about from a sort of a positive vantage point, if we were to think about Annette LaRoe's work around conservative cultivation, we might think that, white parents who are actively engaged in school and are pushing for their kids and helping the school see what their kids are capable of and interacting with the school are disengaging in conservative cultivation, right? That they're just doing what all parents should do, and maybe they're just out competing the African American parents, right? What was striking is that, in the same ways that white parents were able to get what they wanted from the school without a whole lot of fight and struggle, African American parents who tried to engage in that same process, who were middle class, were getting so much resistance and talked about the resistance they experienced, and it was almost like a fight to get the same things that a lot of white parents said they just got by asking. They had, and African American parents talked about having to have an advocate who was in the school to push rather than being able to go directly to the department chair and get something done. So it was while, middle class African American parents may have tried to engage in this process of interacting with the school and trying to get things, they weren't always, while they were often successful, it was often more of a struggle.
So you picked this site because you thought, it should be a pretty positive story on discrimination and race. You find that. I mean, everything's relative, and I'm sure you can find worse. We got Coatesville over here, and I don't know a little bit about that or not, but that's pretty blatant. That's pretty blatant. So this was maybe not as blatant as that, and so it's a long time since Brown, and it's, so does this, and then the people here, in this high school, they recognize it and don't know what to do about it. So that's a pretty systemically negative and disappointing story you're telling here, and I'm,
Where's the outcome?
Where's the light in this?
Yeah.
Maybe there isn't any. I'm not saying there has to be.
There's always light.
There's always.
So, well, don't be depressed. But what I think, what we would say here is that it's not a completely negative story, right? The graduation rates are high. Kids are going to college. Kids aren't dropping out of school. They're doing better. The kids of color are doing better than kids in the nearby city in terms of their academic performance. So it's a story of a partially successful context that still has these lingering vestiges of, well, I wouldn't even call it that, who still has a problem with race and achievement disparities. And so my suggestion is that if we can't get it right in these kinds of places, I'm pessimistic. But my hope is that the book and the work that we've been doing and the continuing work I'm doing with districts will provide some insights into how to make it better, right? How to make a situation that's better than average, better than typical, very successful. So
Sounds like a great book.
and that's a follow up to the. Yeah. So I mean that's our
what
hope.
I call a sales pitch. Sean's got himself a great report. Maybe the book and the report ought to go out in tandem.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering, what role do you think that conversations with parents, like in the PTA, between parents, teachers, and administration, have in this conversation? I feel like, a lot of these studies are about schools, teachers, what the disparities that children see and are inflicted, and then what teachers see. But it sounds like parents ultimately do have a lot of power, and these conversations are not being had with them. At least that I'm not aware of, and I, don't know the field as well. But
Right.
it just seems that parents are left out of the conversation. So,
Yeah. Do you want to
But
add something?
before you answer, can I add to that question?
Yeah.
I had a similar one for you. You said early on that there was recognition, even among the parents, that there were these achievement differences and sort of these racial differences, and the students seem to be, the white students especially, seem to be, really aware of these
Right.
things. Did that surprise you that there was this awareness, and was there discussion that accompanied the awareness of these differences?
Yeah, so here's the sort of limit of this liberalism in this community, right? That there's this clear sense that something is wrong and we care about it. There's a clear sense that we're better than these other communities because we're not all white. There's a clear sense that they want kids in diverse schools, but on the one hand, they're not completely willing to take a chance with changing how things are because they're benefiting from it. And so it's the contradiction that probably many people in this room experience. Where do I live? Where do I move into? What community do I live in? How do I take advantage of this great degree from Penn? So it's a contradiction that a lot of people feel in terms of how they sort of make decisions and determinations. And so I think it's not a clear story. So a lot of times when we talk to middle class and white parents, the conversation seems sort of like it's swayed back and forth. We love the diversity, but we want this all white class. But they wouldn't say it that way, but that's basically what they were saying, And so there's that level of, the decisions that people make about their children are not always straightforward, and there are contradictions there. The other thing that was striking is that a lot of parents said that what their students came home with from the school was both a recognition of a more diverse society, but also often experiencing these ideas about race and intelligence being reinforced by the tracking structure and system in the schools. Mm-hmm. So they were learning not only to embrace their advantages, but to look down on people who weren't doing as well. Mm-hmm. And so it became this process of legitimizing and justifying their privilege, and legitimizing and justifying the fact that other people weren't doing right as well. And this was something that happened for white middle class kids, but also those smaller number of African American, Latino high achievers were sometimes also making these distinctions. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the contradiction of having ideals that you can't necessarily live up to in practice, same as the ostensive and performative aspects of organization. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So it's just something that was most salient to me was the concept of opportunity hoarding, and I think how the conversation talked about weighted grades and things of that nature, how someone's child needs a 4.4 to get into Harvard or Penn or something of that nature. Were there any questions asked to parents about the necessity of facilitating that environment, especially specifically with white parents, in order to kind of fuel the concept that in today's economy you have to have a degree from an Ivy League institution or a very prominent institution in order to maintain your own personal status as an individual human regardless of race, and then kind of seeing how they felt that their actions in trying to opportunity hoard for their students played into that?
Right. I think they wouldn't necessarily frame it as opportunity hoarding. But at the same time, they clearly recognize the inequality. We have a whole chapter on opportunity hoarding. They talk about the disparities in the quality of instruction happening in these different places, and the racial disparities, and the fact that those racial disparities reinforce ideas about racial intelligence. But they were still fighting to maintain their position, right, for their kids. The other thing that often happened, and just to be specific about the ways in which they talked about, getting into these Ivy League schools, one of the things that we talk a lot about is in discipline proceedings how middle class and white parents in particular would evoke this idea of, well, my kids going to Harvard or Yale or Penn or Wisconsin or Michigan or Northwestern. And that therefore, it's just possession, it's not delivery of drugs. So they would try to tweak the definition of what was happening to their kid in terms of disciplinary infractions. And I argue that this is sort of another way that this opportunity hoarding happens, because they're sort of using their resources to impact how the institution disciplines and responds. But oftentimes they said, administrators told us that what they would say is, my kid has a great future, don't ruin it now just because he had a joint. There were some kids who were, this was after 9/11, there were some white kids who were under the building doing who knows what, and in off hours in the tunnels under the building, and they didn't get any kind of harsh discipline for that. And the administrator talked about, if those had been black kids, there would have been a different response. So it's sort of all of these things, and part of it is how parents can intervene and negotiate, and how the school rewards that kind of intervention. Right? So the school becomes complicit in rewarding those kinds of interventions, and it's sort of taken for granted. Yeah, the parent wants the kid in this class, and they can do it or whatever. But if it's going to not be done, and people aren't going to be treated equally in the process, then you either do away with it or accept and write into your policy that if you have this income, you're going to get this response, and if you're white, you're going to get this response, and if you're black and middle class, you're going to get this response. Otherwise, you're sort of you're aiding that process. So she had a question.
Well, I just want to pick up on that though. If the solution is to ask parents to not fight for their kids, there's not going to be a solution.
Right.
I can just tell you that. I just think it's
Right.
parental instinct, and I think it's not just the US of A.
Right.
You see it in lots of places.
Yeah, and I think it's a question of how those advocacy efforts get rewarded and become essentially
That's the
policy.
size. See, it's the
And that's how the
institution
schools
you
are
gotta
rewarded.
control.
That's what, yeah,
Because
exactly.
I don't think you can control it.
No. Yeah.
But I would imagine though, right, that the parents of kids of color were also
They were.
advocating for their children as well. But I'm imagining that there must be some respectability threshold within the school that would produce a different
Right.
set of responses for those
Right.
parents as opposed to the
Right.
white, more affluent parents.
Right. I mean, I think there was a difference in the level of intervention. There were African American parents who were trying to intervene and getting a different response, but there were also more white parents intervening. But what that turned into, again, with this idea of performance expectations, members of the school started anticipating white parent intervention. And so whiteness became sort of symbolic power, right? So a white kid in the context of the school who's struggling, maybe getting a C, administrators said they were more likely to intervene because they anticipated the parent might be on them. So they got the benefit of whiteness, even if their parents weren't the ones advocating. Right? And so again, it becomes
I was wondering in your discussions with the faculty of color if they spoke to microaggressions between faculty and or if especially faculty of color or perhaps white allies were trying to, not flip the system, but empower students of color through affinity groups
Right.
or discussions.
Right.
to acknowledge this.
They were engaged. I mean, individual teachers were engaged in a lot of efforts. They had an AVID program with people, AVID achievement by individual determination, things like that, where there's sort of these affinity groups for students, teachers, individual teachers did work to sort of, for example, accelerate kids through a math sequence by teaching them over the summer. There were a lot of interventions that were relatively successful, but they often depended on individual teachers, be they, white, black, Asian, or Latino teachers. But so it wasn't institutionalized; it was more individual effort. They didn't talk as much about their colleagues because, as we talked to people, in some ways, as they talked about it, they often felt themselves somewhat implicated. And so it wasn't just those teachers over there aren't doing what they're supposed to do. It was our institution can't figure this out. So, yeah.
Connecting to this idea of what can the institution do, and also with the opportunity hoarding idea you mentioned earlier, it made me think about what Bell Hooks and others call language of power. I was kind of curious if there's a part of your study which focused on when those white parents made those requests to bump up their children. What types of appeals did they use? Was there a particular usage? Like, I think you alluded to it earlier that, oh, I know somebody in this community. So like, the access that they had within the school, or even just the way that they presented themselves.
Right.
Like they used more humor. They make those more connections to the Ivy League institutions and,
Right.
and legacy appeals too.
Right. So what we had is multiple people's discussions and conversations about those interactions, and what we found is that that teachers and administrators did talk about this, which college my kid is going to go to, legal actions around discipline, social capital essentially that people bring to bear on the institution. Some work has suggested too that people engage as groups as opposed to individuals. Sometimes that work, but I think to a large extent, the response institutionally seemed to map on to the status of the folks who were making the appeals. So.
Well, John, you definitely got our attention. Thank you very much.